The dawn bled pale gold over the Boone ranch, stretching across acres of frost-bitten grass and wooden fences silvered by the night's breath. Elias Boone stood at the edge of his land, boots sunk in the brittle earth, a man carved out of silence. The wind carried no voices here, only the restless creak of the barn door and the hollow echo of his own heartbeat. Acres to his name, cattle enough to feed 3 towns, and not a single soul to inherit it. Some men are haunted by ghosts. Elias Boone was haunted by the absence of one. In the town 2 miles east, a woman walked with the slowness of someone who had run out of places to arrive. Clara May Hensley's dress, once black with mourning, had been worn to a dull, weathered gray. She clutched Samuel's small hand, his fingers cold and birdlike in her palm. Dust clung to their shoes, and whispers clung to their backs. "Hensley girl," a voice hissed as they passed the mercantile. "No roof, no kin. Poor little boy." Clara kept her gaze fixed on the uneven boards of the boardwalk, swallowing the stone in her throat. Inside the mercantile, the air smelled of flour and lamp oil. Clara placed a loaf of bread on the counter and turned out her coins, the meager clink echoing too loudly in the quiet room. Martha Ellison's eyes softened, but her hands stayed still. "You're a few cents short, honey." Clara's fingers trembled against the wood. "Please. Just this once." The door swung open then, bringing with it a sweep of cold air and the sharp, clean scent of leather and rain. Elias Boone stepped inside, his shadow stretching long across the floorboards. He didn't look at Clara when he reached past her, dropping a coin beside hers. The sound of silver on wood felt heavier than it should. Clara's back stiffened. "I didn't ask for charity," she said, voice brittle. Elias met her gaze for a fraction of a moment, his eyes dark as wet earth. "Wasn't offering charity," he murmured. "Just don't like seeing a boy go hungry." He turned and left, boots striking against the boards like punctuation. Outside, Samuel tugged at his mother's skirt, wide-eyed at the stranger who had bought their bread. Clara knelt to his level, forcing steadiness into her voice. "Don't look at him like that. We owe him nothing." But her hands shook as she tore the loaf in half, steam curling up like a prayer they couldn't name. By evening, the town's whispers had gathered like storm clouds. In the lamplight of the saloon and the dry hush of the church steps, voices curled around the same truths. "Boone's got all that land and no heir. Shame to see a name die out." Another voice followed, lower, meaner. "And that Hensley widow, dragging her boy through the dirt. Some folks ain't meant for happy endings." Their words traveled on the wind, reaching ears they were never meant for. The boarding house smelled of damp wood and stale tobacco. Clara stood at the counter, Samuel leaning against her skirt, exhaustion painting shadows under his eyes. "I can work," she pleaded. "Clean rooms, wash sheets. We just need a roof for the night." The innkeeper shook his head without malice, only weariness. "No rooms. No space for strays." Samuel's lip trembled. "Mama, where do we sleep now?" His voice was a whisper, but it carried through Clara's bones like a crack. She bent, pressing her forehead to his, willing herself not to cry. That was when the sound of hooves broke the night. Elias Boone dismounted with the ease of a man who belonged to the saddle more than the ground. He hadn't meant to stop. He'd only been passing through, the reins guiding him on familiar paths. But the boy's question, carried on the brittle night air, rooted him in place. Clara turned, her spine straightening like a blade drawn from its sheath. Her face, lit by the weak lantern above the door, held pride cracked thin over desperation. "You," she said, voice low, as if naming him summoned something dangerous. Elias's eyes slid to Samuel, then back to her. He didn't speak for a long moment. When he did, his words were plain, almost careless, but heavy as iron. "You want a home." Clara's chin lifted. "And what if I do? I need a child as heir." His voice was steady, stripped of any flourish, as if the earth itself spoke through him. He stepped closer, the lamplight catching the lines carved deep around his mouth. "Maybe we can be what the other lacks." Clara's breath caught, the weight of his words hitting her chest like a slow tide. Behind her, Samuel's small fingers found hers. Pride screamed at her to turn away. Fear told her to run. But the boy's hand, warm and trembling, anchored her to the moment. Her voice was almost a whisper. "You don't even know me." Elias's gaze didn't waver. "I know enough. A boy needs a home. A name needs a son." There was no romance in it, no softness, just two lives bartering survival under a sky too wide to care. Samuel peered around his mother's skirt, eyes wide, his small voice breaking the silence. Would we stay warm?" The question cut through Clara like glass. Elias knelt, his massive frame folding with surprising gentleness. He met the boy's eyes, and for a heartbeat, something unspoken passed between them, a quiet recognition of loneliness, the kind only children and men who've buried too much can share. "You'd stay warm," he said softly. The wind stirred dust around their boots, carrying the faint smell of hay and rain. Clara's pulse roared in her ears as she looked down at the outstretched hand he held toward her, rough from work, steady as stone. Behind him, the night seemed to hold its breath, waiting for her answer. She didn't take it. Not yet. But she didn't turn away, either. The space between them thrummed with something fragile and alive, a bargain written in silence and need. Samuel pressed against her side, his small heartbeat fluttering like a trapped bird. For the first time in months, Clara May Hensley let herself imagine walls that didn't belong to strangers, a roof that wouldn't leak, and a man's voice, not cruel, not kind, just steady, filling the hollow spaces of her days. Her fingers twitched inches from his. The lantern light caught the edge of Elias Boone's face, and she thought she saw the faintest flicker of fear behind the steadiness in his eyes, not of her, but of hope itself. The wind shifted. Somewhere in the distance, a lone coyote cried into the night, and the sound carried like a warning and a promise all at once. The Boone house smelled of pine and old ash, the scent of a life lived in solitude. Clara stood in the doorway, Samuel pressed to her side, their voices swallowed by the vastness of the empty rooms. The walls seemed to listen, the kind of silence that carried its own weight. Elias set their meager belongings on the floor and stepped back, almost awkward in his own home. "You'll have the room at the end of the hall," he said, voice even, careful. Clara nodded, fingers smoothing Samuel's hair, as if the boy might vanish if she didn't anchor him to her. That first night, the house creaked like an old man settling into bed, and Clara lay awake, staring at a ceiling she did not yet trust. Beside her, Samuel's breath was soft, his small body curled against her side. Through the thin walls, she heard Elias's boots cross the floor, then the low murmur of him stoking the fire. A man making sure strangers stayed warm. Her chest ached at the thought. By morning, the wind had calmed, and the land stretched out under a sky so blue it hurt to look at. Samuel followed Elias to the barn, his steps hesitant at first. The foal was skittish, a slip of a creature with legs too long for its own body. Elias crouched, his large hands slow and steady. "Careful hands make strong lives," he told the boy, his voice low, like sharing a secret meant only for him. Clara watched from the porch, her fingers gripping the railing. It wasn't tenderness exactly, but something quieter, something that reached deeper. Days bled into each other, marked not by grand declarations but by the soft scrape of chairs, the smell of coffee left cooling on the table, the sound of Samuel's laughter, startling, unpracticed, and so bright it seemed to wake the house itself. Clara stitched curtains from worn fabric, covering windows that had stood bare for years. Elias didn't comment, but one evening she found a fresh spool of thread left neatly on the table. No words, no thanks. Just a quiet acknowledgement. In the exchange of these small mercies, the house began to hum, like a heart learning how to beat again. When they ventured into town, the whispers rose like wind through dry grass. "Convenience, that's all it is," someone muttered. "A bargain, not a marriage." Clara kept her chin high, though her stomach tightened with every passing glance. Elias walked beside her, steady as stone, his hand hovering near Samuel's shoulder. Not touching, but close enough that it felt like a shield. She wondered if he knew how much that small, unspoken gesture mattered. One night, unable to sleep, Clara wandered the house. The floorboards sighed under her bare feet as she followed the faint glow of a lantern to the barn. The air was cool and heavy with the scent of hay and leather. Elias stood with his back to her, hands braced on the stall door, shoulders bowed under some unseen weight. His voice was barely more than a breath. "If you were here, Pa, I'd tell you. I tried." The words hung in the air, raw and unguarded. Clara stepped back into the shadows, her chest tightening. His loneliness wasn't just a wound, it was a mirror of her own. In that moment she stopped seeing his proposal as a transaction and began to see it as something fragile and unspoken, two broken lives weaving a net, not to climb out of their grief, but to keep each other from falling further. The storm came sudden, a hard slap of wind and rain that turned the land into a blur of gray. Samuel had been chasing the foal near the edge of the pasture when the thunder cracked the sky in half. Clara's scream caught in her throat as she saw the boy's small shape vanish into the downpour. Elias was already moving, boots pounding the mud, reins snapping as he swung into the saddle. His voice cut through the storm like a blade, raw with a panic she had never heard from him. Rain lashed his face, the horse plunging through the blackness. He called Samuel's name again and again, each syllable pulled from somewhere deep and desperate. When he found him, small, shivering under the twisted arms of a tree, Elias slid from the saddle and fell to his knees in the mud. His hands, those rough, steady hands, wrapped Samuel in his coat as if the boy were the last warm thing left in the world. "A man don't need blood to be a father," he whispered, voice breaking against the storm. "He just needs to stay." Clara stood on the porch when they returned, rain plastering her hair to her face. She saw the boy clinging to Elias's chest, saw the way Elias held him, not as an heir, not as a bargain, but as if letting go would undo him. The sight cracked something open inside her, something she had kept locked tight since the day she buried her husband in the hard, cold earth. The next morning, the world smelled of wet earth and new beginnings. Clara hung fresh linens in the yard, the white cloth snapping in the gentle breeze. Samuel chased a ball across the grass, his laughter ringing clear under the open sky. Elias leaned against the fence, watching them, his face unreadable but softer somehow, the edges worn down by something neither of them dared name. Clara wiped her hands on her apron and looked at him. For the first time since that night under the boarding-house lantern, she saw not a man offering a bargain, but a man who had been waiting, perhaps his whole life, for someone to call his silence home. Samuel ran to Elias, wrapping small arms around his leg. Elias froze for a heartbeat, then rested his hand gently on the boy's head. Clara felt the air shift, a quiet promise settling between the three of them. It wasn't love. Not yet. But it was something sturdy enough to grow root. As the sun dipped low, painting the land in amber and shadow, Clara's fingers brushed the railing of the porch, feeling the rough grain beneath her skin. She thought of the night he had held out his hand in the lantern light, of how close she had come to turning away. Her eyes met his across the yard, and for the first time she smiled, not out of gratitude, not out of relief, but out of the fragile, trembling thing that had begun to bloom in her chest. The wind stirred the curtains in the open window behind her, carrying the scent of rain and pine through the house. Somewhere deep inside, she felt the faint hum of walls that were no longer hollow. And beneath it all, a question rose, unspoken but clear as the horizon. If two broken lives could build a home, what else might they dare to build together?